Have you ever stopped to wonder how the West actually built its perception of the East? Like, is it based on raw, on-the-ground reality, or is it a carefully constructed narrative designed to serve a very specific purpose? Well, welcome to this explainer. Today we're going to unpack one of the most fascinating and honestly deeply debated topics in modern history, the complex relationship between knowledge and imperial power. We're going to dive into how learning about a culture can sometimes be the exact tool used to dominate it.
To really wrap our heads around this, we're going to impartially unpack the core arguments of a specific, highly influential book, Edward W. Said's 1978 modern classic, Orientalism. When this was published, Said's theory completely shook up the academic world. He basically argued that the way Europe and America study, depict, and understand the Middle East and Asia isn't just objective science. According to Said, it's a constructed framework, a specific way of seeing that actually enabled colonial expansion. So today, we're going to analyze exactly how Said builds this argument step by step.
To instantly set the stakes for Said's theory, let's travel back a bit. Picture this, it's June 13, 1910. We're in the British House of Commons, and they're debating the British occupation of Egypt. A member of Parliament named J.M. Robertson stands up and challenges former Prime Minister Arthur James Balfour with this exact pointed question. What right have you to take up these airs of superiority with regard to people whom you choose to call Oriental?
Balfour's response is incredibly revealing when it comes to Said's theory. Balfour doesn't justify British rule with military might alone. Instead, he says, we know the civilization of Egypt better than we know the civilization of any other country. To have such knowledge of such a thing is to dominate it. Just think about that for a second. For Balfour, the West possessed superior knowledge of the East, and that knowledge fundamentally justified their colonial rule. To know the Orient was to own the Orient.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for unpacking Said's theory together. First, who defines the Orient? Second, three meanings of Orientalism. Third, imaginative geography and boundaries. Fourth, Napoleon's textual conquest. And finally, the modern echo.
Section 1. Who defines the Orient?
Said argues that the Orient didn't just exist as a natural static fact, it was actively Orientalized by the West. To see how this worked in practice, consider the stark binary drawn by Lord Cromer, a man who essentially ruled Egypt for Britain for 25 years. He defines the European as a close reasoner and a natural logician. In direct opposition, he defines the Oriental as lacking symmetry, slipshod in reasoning, lethargic, and suspicious. Said points out that Cromer used this exact rigid framework to justify Western tutelage. The logic was basically, they can't govern themselves, therefore we must govern them. The definition itself creates the reality.
Section 2. Three meanings of Orientalism.
Orientalism is a massive concept, right? But Said actually breaks it down into three interconnected definitions. First, it's an academic discipline. That includes anyone who teaches, researches, or writes about the Orient. Second, it's a broader imaginative binary used by poets, novelists, and philosophers, a fundamental distinction between East and West. But the third definition is where the power really lies. Said argues that since the late 18th century, Orientalism became a corporate institution for dealing with the Orient. It's a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the East. So academia feeds the imagination, which in turn justifies the institutional dominance.
Section 3. Imaginative geography and boundaries.
So how exactly do we draw lines on a map that are actually psychological boundaries? Well, the crucial concept here is imaginative geography. This is the practice of designating in one's mind a familiar space which is ours, and an unfamiliar space beyond which is theirs. Said argues that geographical boundaries accompany social and ethnic ones, even if they're entirely arbitrary. We create this fictional reality, our land versus their land, and then we start treating that fiction as an objective truth.
Said maps out how this imaginative geography evolved across time, and it is a long history. Way back in the 5th century BC, we see Aeschylus's play, The Persians, where the Greek playwright literally puts words into the mouths of defeated Asians. Fast forward to the 14th century, and Dante is placing Islamic figures into specific, rigid boxes within his Inferno. By the 17th century, scholars like D'Urbino start alphabetically categorizing the East in encyclopedias. Said argues that this long cultural preparation sets the perfect stage for 1798, marking the shift from mere imagination to actual military invasion.
Section 4. Napoleon's textual conquest.
Napoleon's 1798 invasion of Egypt perfectly illustrates Orientalism in action. Now, to understand Napoleon's approach, we have to understand what Said calls the textual attitude. This is the human failing to prefer the clear authority of a book over the messy, disorienting reality of a direct encounter. Napoleon didn't just go to Egypt blindly. He relied on texts, specifically Volney's travel books, to understand Egypt before ever setting foot there. Said argues that when you combine this textual attitude with overwhelming military power, you can actually force reality to match the book.
And this brilliantly illustrates how Napoleon executed this textual conquest. He didn't just bring soldiers to conquer Egypt, he brought a massive team of scholars, chemists, and historians. He formed the Institut d'Egypte. Their entire job was to record, categorize, and document absolutely everything. The result was this massive 23-volume publication called the Description de l'Egypte. Through this, Napoleon effectively turned a living, breathing country into a department of French learning. The secretary of that very institute, Jean-Baptiste Joseph Fourier, wrote a very telling line in the preface of their massive work. He said, "Egypt was the theater of his glory and preserves from oblivion all the circumstances of this extraordinary event." Notice the phrasing there. Egypt is reduced to a theater for Napoleon's glory. Said points out that this framing entirely displaces actual Egyptian history. The Orient simply becomes a silent stage for European actions and European science.
Finally, Section 5, the modern echo.
Orientalism certainly didn't stop in the 19th century. Said asks us to look at modern geopolitics, examining texts like a well-known essay by Henry Kissinger. Notice the similarities to Lord Cromer's binary we talked about earlier. Kissinger divides the world into two halves. The developed West is labeled post-Newtonian, believing in an external empirical reality. The developing world is labeled pre-Newtonian, where reality is just internal to the observer. Said neutrally points out that despite the modern vocabulary being used, this is the exact same binary framework constructed by Balfour and Cromer decades earlier, separating the rational us from the irrational them.
Said argues that he finds this echo everywhere in modern institutions. Take, for instance, a 1972 article in the American Journal of Psychiatry by Harold W. Glidden. The article asserts that Arabs stress conformity, that prestige is based solely on dominating others, that objectivity isn't a value, and that their society basically runs on anxiety and suspicion. For Edward Said, this perfectly demonstrates his core argument. The 19th century academic stereotyping hasn't vanished at all. It simply persists, disguised as modern psychiatric or political expertise.
By unpacking Said's theory, we get a fascinating, challenging perspective on the intricate relationship between knowledge and power. Said argues that, for centuries, the West's study of the East was never just innocent learning. It was an imaginative geography that justified control. So, whether you agree entirely with his theory or not, it definitely leaves us all with a vital question to ponder for our own media consumption today. How much of what we know about the world is objective reality, and how much is just a legacy of Orientalism? It's definitely something to think about the next time you read a headline.